A woman who'd lost everything twice. A man who'd stopped believing anything could be saved. And an apple orchard in Oregon that was 3 bad harvests from gone. Nobody in Dunmore Crossing expected Celia Vane to last until the first frost. She arrived with 1 trunk, a dead brother's unpaid debts, and the kind of steady eyes that made people uncomfortable because they didn't look away when they should. The orchardist who'd sent for her hadn't bothered to meet her stage. The property looked like it had already made its peace with failing. But Celia had watched failure up close before, and she knew the difference between land that was finished and land that had simply stopped being tended. She wasn't about to let the difference go to waste. The stage depot at Dunmore Crossing was a low building with a shingle roof and a bench out front where an old dog slept regardless of weather. Celia Vane stepped off the coach with her trunk and stood in the October air, watching the other passengers move toward people who'd come to collect them. There were 4 others. By the time the driver had unloaded the last bag and climbed back up to the box, all 4 had been folded into greetings and wagon seats and were heading somewhere with purpose. Celia remained. She set her trunk on the bench beside the dog, who opened one eye and closed it again, and waited. 30 minutes. Then 40. A woman with a market basket came out of a dry goods store across the street, looked at her briefly, and went the other direction. A boy of maybe 10 ran past without looking at anyone. She took the letter from her coat pocket. She'd read it enough times that the paper had gone soft along the folds. Harlan Voss. She noted without irony that the name matched no one in the file she'd read at the correspondence office. Harlan Voss, Dunmore Crossing, Oregon Territory. Apple operation, 40 acres, requires a capable woman for management of household and assistance with harvest accounts. The letter had been 4 sentences. The man was not one for correspondence. The last line had said, "I will meet the Thursday stage at 2 o'clock. It was Thursday. It was past 3. She picked up the trunk handle and crossed the street to the dry goods store. A bell above the door announced her. The man behind the counter had a white beard and the expression of someone who'd been in this town long enough to know everybody's business and the appropriate degree of sympathy for each situation. "Afternoon," Celia said. "I'm looking for directions to the Voss orchard." The man's eyebrows moved in a way that communicated several things at once. "You Harlan Voss's woman?" She didn't particularly like that construction, but she wasn't in a position to argue semantics. "Celia Vane. He was supposed to meet me. Suppose he was." The man, whose name turned out to be Albert Crane, proprietor, leaned forward on the counter. "Road goes north out of town 3 miles. You'll cross a wooden bridge. 1 plank's been loose since August. Step to the right side, then left at the fork where the madrone tree split in half. You'll see the orchard on the hillside before you see the house. Is there a horse I can hire?" Albert looked at her trunk, then at the sky, which had gone from overcast to decisive. "I got a mule I can spare until morning. I'll bring it back in the morning. See that you do." She loaded the trunk across the mule's back and rode north out of Dunmore Crossing on an animal that expressed its opinions about pace through its ears. The road was rutted and damp, the particular damp of Oregon in October that wasn't quite rain, but wasn't not rain either. She kept her collar up and her eyes on the madrone tree. She had been a farmer's daughter in Ohio, and then a farmer's wife in Kansas for 6 years, and then a widow. And then for 2 years, a bookkeeper for her brother's dry goods operation in Missouri, which had gone under when Thomas's lungs gave out in the spring and left her with a ledger full of debt and a trunk full of everything she owned. She was 29 years old. She had steady hands, a good head for numbers, and the ability to look at a problem without needing someone else to tell her how serious it was. She found the split madrone. She took the left fork. The Voss orchard came into view in the late afternoon light, and Celia pulled the mule up for a moment and simply looked at it. 40 acres on a hillside above a creek, the apple trees in long rows that had once been well managed and weren't anymore. She could see it even from the road, the way the rows had been left unpruned, dead branches still hanging where they'd broken, grass grown high between the trunks. A farmhouse sat at the near edge of the property, 2 stories, a good structure, but showing the particular kind of neglect that comes from one person trying to manage too many things at once. There was smoke from the chimney. That was something. She rode up the lane and dismounted at the porch. The porch boards were sound, which she noted. Whoever Harlan Voss was, he'd attended to the structural things at least. She tied the mule to the post and knocked. The man who opened the door was tall and angular, somewhere in his mid-40s, with dark hair gone gray at the temples and the kind of hands that had been worked hard for a long time. He had not shaved in several days. He looked at her with the expression of someone who had been expecting a thing and still wasn't quite prepared for it. "You're Celia Vane," he said. "I am." She kept her voice even. "You didn't come." He had the decency to look uncomfortable. "The wagon threw a wheel on the creek road this morning. By the time it's all right." It wasn't entirely, but she wasn't going to stand on a porch in the October damp debating it. "Is there somewhere I can put the mule for the night?" Harlan Voss looked at the mule, then at her trunk, then at her face, which she kept carefully arranged. "Come in," he said, stepping back. "I'll see to it." The inside of the house told her what she needed to know about the last few years. It was a man's house in the particular way that means no woman had organized it in a long time. Not dirty, but disordered. The kitchen was functional but bare. A table, 2 chairs, a stove that needed blacking. A bookshelf with 2 almanacs and a book on apple grafting that had been read to pieces and repaired with twine. A framed photograph on the mantel, a woman and a small boy, the photograph the kind that gets dusted around rather than moved. Celia set her trunk beside the door and looked at the room the way she'd learned to look at any situation that required understanding before acting. She could see what was wrong and what could be fixed. The stove damper was adjusted incorrectly. It would burn through the wood twice as fast as needed. The window on the north wall had a gap in the frame that was letting in a thin, cold draft. The floor needed sweeping but was otherwise sound. Harlan came back in from the barn, stomping mud off his boots. "Mule's settled." "Thank you." She turned from the window. "Mr. Voss, I'd like to see the ledgers tonight if that's possible." He stopped in the act of hanging up his coat. "Tonight, I want to understand what I'm dealing with." He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who had expected something different and was recalibrating. Then he went to the desk in the corner and pulled out a ledger book and set it on the table without a word. She sat down and opened it. He made supper: salt pork, dried beans, cornbread that was slightly underdone, and she read the ledger while he cooked and asked questions without looking up from the pages. "How many bearing trees?" 31. Was 38. "Lost 7 to the fire blight 2 summers back." She made a note. "And the press? Is it operational?" "Needs a new gear. I've been managing without." "Since when?" A pause. 2 harvests. She looked up at him then. He was at the stove with his back to her, and she could see the set of his shoulders, which was the set of a man who knew the number was bad and had been living with it long enough to stop being surprised by it. "How much of the harvest are you losing to spoilage because you can't press?" "More than I'd like to say." She wrote that down too. They ate supper in the particular silence of people who don't know each other and have agreed by sitting at the same table to try. The cornbread was what it was. She ate it without comment. "I should have sent better directions," Harlan said at one point, without preamble. She looked up. He was looking at his plate. "It's a hard road to find in the dark," he said. "I should have sent a map with the last letter. I knew the stage times. You didn't." "No." He was quiet for a moment. "It was a bad start." "It was," she said. "But I'm here." He nodded once slowly in the way of a man processing a fact he hadn't quite expected to be true. "How long were you married?" he asked after a while. 6 years. "My husband died of a fever in Kansas. The farm went to debt." She kept her voice factual. "I went to Missouri to help my brother with his accounts. He died in the spring. His debts followed me." She set down her fork. "I had some time to decide what came next." This was it. He looked at the photograph on the mantel, then away from it, in the quick, particular way of someone who has decided not to look and is still doing it. "My wife died 4 years ago," he said. "Eleanor. The boy, Emmett, he's with her people in Portland now. He was 8 when she went. I thought it was better for him." Stopped. "I'm not certain anymore." She didn't push on it. It wasn't the time. She lay in the narrow upstairs room that night and went through the ledger numbers in her head. The picture they assembled was not good, but it was not finished. There was a difference, and she'd learned to see it. The orchard had 31 bearing trees that hadn't been properly pruned in at least 2 seasons. Unpruned apple trees didn't die. They just produced less, and smaller and more erratically. The press gear could be replaced if someone knew where to source it and what it cost. The blight loss was the fixed number, the thing that couldn't be undone, but 31 trees managed well was a different proposition than 31 trees managed the way they'd been managed. She made her list by the light of the small lamp on the nightstand. Press gear, source and cost. Pruning, condition of tools, timing window, seller, capacity and current stores, credit at Crane's, what is available. Then she added one more line. The boy in Portland, understand more before speaking. She was asleep before the lamp burned out. She was up before dawn. She had always been this way, some mechanism in her that couldn't rest while there was daylight coming. She built up the kitchen stove correctly, adjusting the damper first, and put the coffee on, stood at the kitchen window while it heated, looking at the orchard in the gray pre-dawn. The trees were there. That was the first thing. Whatever had happened to this place, the trees were still there. She heard Harlan's boots on the stairs and didn't turn around. You're up, he said. The damper on the stove was wrong. It'll hold heat better now. A pause. I've had it that way since. He stopped. Since Eleanor, she said, not unkindly. I know. The coffee's almost ready. He came into the kitchen and stood on the far side of the stove, looking at nothing in particular. There was a quality to his stillness in the mornings that she was beginning to understand. Not unfriendliness, but the particular careful manner of a man who had organized his life around absence and didn't quite know what to do with presence. I want to walk the orchard this morning, she said. Before you start on anything else, I want to see all of it. He looked at her. In this light, light's coming. They walked the orchard as the sun came over the eastern ridge, Harlan talking in his sparse way, Celia listening and looking and making notes in the small book she carried in her coat pocket. She learned the rows by section. The north section, oldest trees, still the strongest producers when properly managed. The south slope, younger trees, the ones that had come in under Eleanor's hand 8 years ago. She could tell by the spacing, more deliberate, planted with a longer future in mind. The east block where the fire blight had taken the 7. She stopped at the east block for a long moment. They're cut out, she said. Stumps. I pulled them the first year. Good. She walked the space between the stumps. This section could go back into production in 5 years if you graft rootstock this spring, provided the blight's gone from the soil. He looked at the ground. Is it? I don't know. I'd need to test, or ask someone who knows this valley's soil. She made a note. Is there an extension agent in the county? He blinked. The question had clearly not occurred to him. There might be. In Ashton, maybe. I'll find out. They came back to the house by mid-morning, and she made oatmeal with the last of a jar of preserves she found in the back of the pantry, and he ate it in the way that told her it was better than what he'd been making for himself. He didn't say anything about it, but he finished the bowl and then sat for a moment looking at the table with a slightly different expression than he'd had before. What do you need from Crane's? He said. I need to see what's there and what it costs before I ask for anything. She was already pulling on her coat. I'll ride to town this morning. The mule needs to go back anyway. I can come. She looked at him. He wasn't offering company. She understood enough about him by now to know he didn't do that easily. He was checking on her in the careful, sideways way of a man who wouldn't say so. The pruning tools, she said. Can you check their condition while I'm gone? I need to know if they're usable or if we need to have them sharpened. Something in his posture settled. I can do that. She knew Elbert Crane was going to be an important conversation before she walked through the door. She was right. He was behind the counter again, and this time a woman was with him. His daughter-in-law, it turned out, a practical-looking woman in her 30s named Addie, who ran the accounts while Elbert managed the floor and pretended otherwise. Voss's woman, Elbert said by way of greeting. Celia Vane, she said, for the second time pleasantly. I'd like to look at what you carry and then talk about the account, if you're willing. Addie looked up from the ledger and took her measure in about 4 seconds. Whatever she found, she came around the counter. Coffee, she said, not a question. Celia walked the store with the coffee. She looked at everything. Hardware, dry goods, the small section of orchard supplies, copper spray for blight, pruning wax, twine, seed stock for the kitchen garden. She found the gear supplier's catalog wedged between 2 tins of hardware and pulled it out and spent 10 minutes with it. You carry special orders? She asked Addie. If there's a count in good standing. Celia looked at the catalog. The press gear Harlan needed was listed. The price was less than she'd feared, more than the account could easily bear, but not impossible. She wrote down the item number and the price and put the catalog back. What's the condition of Harlan Voss's account? She said. Addie showed her without being asked. The number was what Harlan had told her, thin but not gone. Celia looked at it for a long time, doing arithmetic in her head, Then she crossed 3 items off her own list and kept 2. "Tell him I was here and I was careful," she said to Addie. "I generally tell people what I see," Addie said, which was its own kind of answer. On her way out, Elbert stopped her. "The Voss place," he said, in the tone of a man with information he wasn't sure he should share. "You know about Sutter?" She did not. She turned back. Elbert leaned on the counter. "Randolph Sutter. Runs the cannery operation up on the river. He's been buying orchard land in this valley for 3 years. Whenever someone gets behind enough that they can't hold on." He looked at the door, then back at her. "Harlan's been behind for 2 years. Has Sutter made an offer? I can't say for certain. But Sutter pays attention when someone's struggling. He's patient." Celia looked at Elbert Crane's face, which was the face of a man who liked Harlan Voss and didn't like Randolph Sutter and had told her what he could. "Thank you," she said. She rode back to the orchard thinking about a man she hadn't met yet, who was watching from somewhere with the patience of someone who believed he had time on his side. She found Harlan at the equipment shed. He had all 4 pruning saws laid out on a workbench and was examining the blades with the focused attention of a man who felt better when he had something to assess. 2 were usable. 2 needed a smith. "Both," she said, looking them over. "Can you get them to the smith in Ashton? Day's ride. Would Aldous at the Frey place do it?" She'd seen a blacksmith operation marked on the map in Crane's store. He looked at her. "How do you know about Aldous Frey?" Addie mentioned him. Said he does good edge work. Harlan picked up one of the dull saws. "He does. I didn't think to ask." He said it the way he said most things about the last 2 years, without self-pity, just as a flat accounting of what had been missed. One person trying to hold too many things at once, and the things that should have been asked not getting asked. "Harlan," she said. He looked at her. "Sutter, has he spoken to you?" The saw went still in his hands. "Once. Last winter." His jaw had a quality she was starting to recognize, a held-back tension that lived there when something was being kept controlled. "Made an offer on the north section. Said he knew I was having trouble and he didn't want to see good orchard land go to waste. What did you say?" "I said no." He set the saw down. "The north section is the best I have. My father planted those trees. He'll come back. I expect so." She didn't say anything else then. She filed it and went to start supper. And the sound of Harlan sharpening what blades he could came from the equipment shed as the Oregon evening came down over the orchard. The real cold didn't arrive until mid-November, but when it came hard, the kind of cold that found every gap in every wall and made itself known. Celia woke one morning to find ice on the inside of her window glass and went downstairs to find Harlan already at the stove, which he'd built up wrong again out of habit, the damper back in the old position. She didn't say anything about the damper. She moved him gently aside and adjusted it herself, and he watched and didn't argue. The first week she learned the shape of the days. Harlan was up before her most mornings. She'd hear his boots on the porch steps before light, and out in the orchard doing the work that didn't stop because the season had. Dead branch removal, checking the grafting supplies, laying out the tools for the pruning work that would happen once the trees were fully dormant. He came in for meals and ate them fully and said little, but she'd learned that his silence wasn't unfriendly. It was simply the language of a man who'd gotten used to there being no one to talk to. She made the kitchen function better by degrees, found where things should logically be and moved them there. Discovered a root cellar under the house that had more in it than he'd mentioned, 2 crates of the fall's eating apples, well stored, some dried beans, a good supply of winter squash. She reorganized it so the most perishable things came out first and made a note of what they'd have and what they'd need. One evening at the end of the second week, she was at the kitchen table with her notebook when Harlan came in from outside and stopped in the doorway and looked at her. "What are you writing?" he said. "Spring plan for the East Block. If we're going to graft rootstock, I need to know what variety and how many and when to order." She looked up. "Is that something you want to do?" He stood in the doorway for a moment. Something moved across his face that she couldn't quite name, complicated, carrying more than one thing at once. "Eleanor wanted to replant it with Gravensteins," he said finally. She had it all worked out. Where they'd go, how to stagger the ages so we'd always have some young trees coming up behind. Celia held his gaze steadily. "Do you still have what she worked out?" He was quiet. Then he crossed the kitchen and opened the drawer in the desk and came back with a folded paper worn at the creases. He set it on the table in front of her without unfolding it and went back to hang up his coat. She unfolded it carefully. It was a hand-drawn map of the East Block, detailed and precise, with variety names and planting distances, noted in a small, careful hand. Eleanor Voss had been someone who planned with a future in mind. "This is good work," Celia said. She was. He stopped. He poured himself coffee and stood at the window with it. She knew what this place could be. Celia looked at the map for a long moment. Then she set it on the table between them, open. "So do I," she said. "And I think she was right about the Gravensteins." He looked at the map, then at her, then away. She went back to her notebook, and he stood at the window finishing his coffee, and neither of them said anything else. But he didn't leave the kitchen either. And after a while, the silence had a different quality to it, the kind that two people make when they've quietly agreed that being in the same room is enough for now. The press gear arrived from the supplier 6 weeks after she'd placed the order, on a wet December morning when the road to town was barely passable. Harlan went for it himself, and came back with the crate strapped in the wagon bed and mud to his knees, and she had soup on the stove when he came in, and he ate 2 bowls of it without sitting down first, still in his wet coat. "It's the right part?" she said. "It's the right part." He finally sat down. There was something in his face that was new, not quite hope, but the precursor to it. The expression of a man who has just been handed the first piece of something he'd stopped believing he'd have again. "Come spring," she said, "we can press again." "Come spring," he said. She had been right about Randolph Sutter's patience. He came in January. Celia saw him from the kitchen window, a well-built man on a well-fed horse, riding up the orchard lane with the comfortable ease of someone who traveled without hurrying because he knew where everything was going to end up. She had time to note the quality of his coat and his horse and the particular way he sat, which was the way of a man who had made a great many decisions about other people's property and been right enough times that he'd stopped doubting himself. She got to the door before he knocked. "Mrs. Vane," he said, which told her he'd been making inquiries. "Is Harlan in?" "He's in the orchard. I can walk out with you." She walked with him. She did this deliberately. Sutter was the kind of man who would make his approach in private if given the option, and she didn't intend to give it to him. Harlan saw them coming across the frost-hard grass and straightened from the work he was doing. His face did the thing it did when he was keeping himself level. Sutter was pleasant. She had expected this. He asked about the winter, about the orchard, about how the North Block trees were coming along after the 2 dry summers. He had the manner of a man who was genuinely interested in what he was assessing, which probably made him effective at acquiring it. Then, with the same pleasant continuity, he said, "I know the press has been down 2 seasons. I know what that costs an operation this size. I've got a fair offer on the North Block and the East Block combined, and I'm not here to pressure you, Harlan. I'm here because I'd rather see you get something for it than watch you get nothing." Celia was standing 2 feet to Harlan's left. She spoke before he did, not loudly. "The press is operational," she said. Sutter looked at her. He recalibrated, visibly, in the small, smooth way of a man who did it often. "As of when?" "The gear came last month. Harlan will be pressing in the spring." She kept her voice conversational. "And the East Block is going back into production this year. Grafting starts in March." She let a moment pass. "We have Eleanor Voss's plan for it." She watched Sutter take in the word "we." He was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled, the smile of a man who knew he'd come expecting one situation and found another. "Good to hear," he said. "The valley needs its orchards." After he rode out, Harlan stood in the frost-stiffened grass for a moment without speaking. Then he turned to her. "The grafting plan," he said. "You're sure?" "I've been working out the numbers since December," she said. "It's not fast and it's not certain, but it's possible." He looked at the East Block, at the stumps and the open ground. Then he looked at her. "You had Eleanor's map memorized. I've read it enough times." He was quiet for a moment. The cold morning air was very still. "Thank you," he said, and it came out with more weight than 2 words ordinarily carried. She went back inside to start the midday meal, and behind her she heard Harlan go back to his work in the orchard with a pace that was slightly different from what it had been before, steadier, less like a man doing the next necessary thing, and more like a man who had a reason for where the next necessary thing was going. February was the long month. It always was. The cold settled into a permanent condition, and everything required more effort than it had in October. Water had to be hauled before it froze. The stove maintained hour by hour. The orchard checked for damage after every wind. Celia kept her lists and crossed things off and added new things and kept the lists. It was the only way she knew to stay ahead of a situation that was always trying to get ahead of her. She learned things about Harlan Voss in those enclosed weeks. She learned that he wrote to Emmett twice a month, careful letters that he composed slowly at the kitchen table, occasionally asking her how to spell a word without apparent embarrassment. She learned that Emmett wrote back in the handwriting of a 10-year-old who had been taught well by someone who cared. Eleanor's mother, she gathered. The letters from Emmett were short, 3 or 4 sentences, and Harlan kept them in the desk drawer under Eleanor's planting map. She learned that he had a temper of the quiet, controlled kind, not at her, not at anyone, but at things that broke and circumstances that didn't yield. She saw it once, when a branch came down in a night wind and took out a section of the young south slope trees. 2 of them cracked at the base. He went out in the morning and stood looking at them for a long time without moving. Then he went to get the saw. She brought him coffee without being asked. He took it without comment, and they stood together in the cold, looking at what the wind had done. "They can be grafted?" she asked. "The root systems are sound." He turned the cup in his hands. "I think so. Then it's not a loss. It's a delay." He looked at her. There was something in the look that had started appearing in the last few weeks, a directness that wasn't there in November, a willingness to hold the look longer than necessary. "You do that," he said. "Do what?" "Find the angle that's not a loss." She thought about that. "Someone has to. You don't have to force it." "I'm not forcing it," she said. "A graftable root system genuinely isn't a loss. That's just arithmetic." He almost smiled. She'd seen something like it once or twice before, a shift in the set of his mouth that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the same direction. He went back to work, and she stood with her coffee and looked at the orchard, which was covered in the gray of February but was underneath it the same 40 acres it had always been, waiting for the kind of attention it hadn't been getting. She found the boys' room on a Sunday afternoon when she was looking for a particular length of twine she thought she'd seen in the upstairs hall closet. The door at the end of the hall was closed but not locked, and she opened it without thinking and found a child's room, neat and untouched. A bed with a quilt, a small bookshelf with books arranged by size, a carved wooden horse on the windowsill. Emmett's room. She stood in the doorway without entering, understanding immediately that she had walked into the careful preservation of something. The books were dusty but not chaotic. Someone had cleaned in here regularly and not changed anything. She pulled the door closed quietly and didn't mention it. That evening she did mention something else. She waited until supper was done and the dishes were off the table, and Harlan was at the desk with one of Emmett's letters, which was when she brought it up as gently as she could. "Emmett's going to be 11 in the spring," she said. Harlan looked up. "I don't know what arrangement you have with Eleanor's family," she said, "but the orchard is going to be different by summer. The press will be running. The East Block grafting will be started." She kept her voice steady. "If you wanted him here for the summer to see it, that would be something he could write about." Harlan was quiet for a long time. He looked at the letter in his hands. "Eleanor's mother has been good to him," he said. "I'm sure she has. I didn't want him to see the place the way it's been." Celia looked at the letter in his hands and at his face, which was doing the complicated thing it sometimes did, the thing that carried grief and guilt and love all in the same expression and didn't try to separate them. "It's not the way it's been," she said quietly. "Not anymore." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he set the letter down and picked up his pen and started a new piece of paper. She went to bed that night not knowing what he'd written. She didn't need to. Some things were between a man and his son. The grafting started in March, the second week, when the overnight temperatures were consistently above freezing and the sap was beginning its slow return. Harlan worked the East Block in the mornings, and Celia worked beside him, learning what she didn't know and doing what she could. He was a patient teacher when he was teaching something he'd done his whole life, explaining the angle of the cut, the way to bind the graft so the wood held contact, how to tell if the union had taken. "My father showed me," he said once, working a graft on a knee-high rootstock. He could graft by feel, didn't even have to look at the cut. Was the orchard his? His and my mother's. I grew up here. He tied the binding and moved to the next. Eleanor fell in love with it before she fell in love with me. She used to say the trees were the better deal. It was the first time he'd said anything about Eleanor with something lighter in it. Celia received it without making too much of it. Were they? She said. He considered the question seriously. The trees don't have opinions about supper, he said. She laughed, a real laugh, not a polite one. It surprised them both slightly. He looked at her with the expression she'd come to understand was his version of warmth, and went back to the graft. Sutter came back in April, not with an offer this time. He came with a question about the property line along the river easement, a boundary that had apparently been unclear for years. It was the kind of visit designed to seem reasonable while communicating that he was still watching, still patient, still available if things went wrong. Celia was in the garden when his horse came up the lane. She had put in the kitchen beds 2 weeks earlier, peas and early greens in the lower section, a bed of herbs near the kitchen door that had been bare dirt since at least the previous owner. She was on her knees in the herb bed when she heard the hoofbeats and straightened and looked. She went to find Harlan. This time she sat at the kitchen table when Sutter came inside. He looked at her sitting there and adjusted his approach in the same small, invisible way as before, like a man used to adapting when circumstances didn't arrange themselves as expected. The easement question was exactly what she'd expected. Vague, not quite an accusation, technically reasonable. A way of saying, I'm still here without saying it. The original survey's in the county clerk's office in Ashton. Celia said when Sutter had finished presenting the question. I had a copy made when I went up in February. She hadn't mentioned this to Harlan, who looked briefly startled and then settled his expression. The river easement runs along the established line. Our fence is 6 feet inside it. She kept her voice pleasant, so there's no issue to resolve. Sutter looked at her for a moment, then at Harlan, then at the room, at the kitchen that was organized and running, at the notebook on the counter with its columns of figures, at the press gear catalog on the shelf. He was reading the room the way men like him did, looking for signs of trouble, looking for the angle that led to the thing he wanted. He found, she suspected, something different from what he'd expected to find. Good to have it documented, he said. We thought so, Harlan said, the word we again, without hesitation. She heard it land the same way it had in January. After Sutter rode out, Harlan came and stood in the kitchen and looked at her for a long moment. February, he said. You went to Ashton in February. The roads were bad, she said, but passable. You didn't tell me. I didn't want to worry you about something that wasn't a problem yet. She met his eyes. It's still not a problem. He was quiet, looking at her with the direct look that had become something she counted on for its honesty. His face was doing the thing it did when something had moved past the point of being managed carefully and was asking to be said. Celia, he said. She waited. I wrote to Emmett, he said, asked if he'd come for the summer. He paused. He wants to come for the summer. She felt something shift in her, a weight redistributing. Good, she said. He's going to want to know about you. Tell him I grow herbs and I carry a notebook everywhere, and I know how to graft a Gravenstein. Harlan looked at her for a long moment. There was something in the look that was clear and direct and full of something that had been accumulating since October through the cold and the press gear and the East Block in February in Ashton and every morning at the kitchen table. I want to say something, he said, and I'm not certain I have the words for it right. She waited. When I wrote that advertisement, he said, I thought it would be practical. Someone to keep the books and help with the harvest. I didn't. He stopped, looking for the thing he meant. I didn't expect this. Neither did I, she said. He crossed the kitchen. He stood in front of her with the open expression of a man who had decided that what was on his face was going to be on his face. I want to make this a real marriage, he said. Not an arrangement, a marriage. She looked at this man who had not met her stage and had written patient letters to his son by lamplight and had gone to the county clerk's office. Except it had been her who'd gone, she remembered, and he who'd needed it done, who had said we to Randolph Sutter twice and had stood in a broken orchard in the October light and not given up on it. It already is, she said. He kissed her, and it was not smooth or performed. It was the real kind, the kind between people who know what they're risking and have decided to risk it anyway. And the kitchen was warm from the April sun, and outside the orchard was doing what orchards do in spring, which is insist on themselves. She thought about Thomas, her brother, briefly, about the ledger she'd balanced for 2 years before the numbers stopped adding up, about the trunk she'd packed and the stage out of Missouri, and the dog sleeping on the bench at the Dunmore Crossing depot. How a life built in one direction comes apart, and you have to stand there and decide what the next direction is. She had decided, and she was here, entirely here, which was different from how she'd been for a long time. The Gravenstein grafts took. Harlan found the first one on a Monday in May, the tiny new growth pushing from the union where graft met rootstock, pale green and insistent. He came inside, and she knew from his face before he said anything. They went out together and walked the east block in the early morning light, going from graft to graft, and 11 of the 15 had taken. Not all of them, but more than she'd expected. Emmett arrived in June on the Thursday stage. She was the one who went to meet it. He was 10 years old, small for his age, with his father's dark coloring and the careful expression of a child who had learned to assess new situations before committing to them. He stood on the depot platform with his bag and looked at her with Eleanor's eyes, which she knew from the photograph, dark and measuring. "You're Celia," he said. "I am." She didn't offer anything else immediately. She let him look. "My father says you know about grafting," he said. "Some. Your mother knew more. I've been working from her plan." Something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, not the way it would in a story that needed it to. Just a small opening, a degree of the careful assessment relaxing into something else. "She liked the Gravensteins," he said. "So do I." Celia picked up his bag. "Come on. The orchard wants to show you something." The summer was hard in the good way, the way that takes everything you have and gives it back to you as something you've made. The press ran in August for the first time in 2 seasons, and the sound of it, the particular grinding, productive sound of a press working correctly, brought Harlan out of the orchard and Emmett running from wherever he'd been, and the 3 of them stood in the press house listening to it run. Emmett asked to work the lever himself. Harlan showed him how. She stood in the doorway of the press house and watched father and son at the lever, watched Harlan's hand guide Emmett's on the first press, and felt the quiet particular satisfaction of a thing that had been broken and wasn't broken anymore. Not fixed in the sense of being made new. The East Block would take years. The orchard still needed 2 seasons of careful management before it would be what Eleanor had imagined. But operating, moving in the right direction, tended. Sutter bought the Morrison place up the road in October, which was what he'd wanted all along, and the Valley noted that the Voss orchard had not been part of the transaction and moved on to other business. The grafted trees would bear in their 4th year. Celia calculated it every spring with the same arithmetic, and every spring the number came 1 year closer. Emmett came back the next summer, and the summer after that, and the summer after that he didn't come back, because he came to stay, which was a different thing entirely, and one that Harlan had not been certain would happen, and which was, when it did, the particular kind of good that doesn't have a word big enough for it. The orchard was never finished, because orchards don't work that way. There was always a tree that needed attention, a new section to plan, a season that didn't cooperate, a year that gave more than expected, and a year that gave less. You managed it, and you kept the accounts, and you made your lists, and crossed things off, and started new lists. That was the work, and the work didn't end, and that was also the point of it. What Celia Vane had arrived with was a trunk, a head for numbers, and the stubbornness of someone who had decided that the next thing was worth getting to. What she found was not what she'd arranged for. It was made of ordinary things, grafting twine and press gears, and a child's careful handwriting, and a man who wrote to his son by lamplight and didn't stop when the orchard gave him every reason to. It happened the way real things happen, slowly, without announcement, through the weight of days worked in the same direction. The Gravensteins bore in their 4th year, exactly when she'd said they would. The apples were dense and tart, and the color of a good sunset, and Emmett brought the first bushel to the press house himself, and the cider from them was the best the orchard had ever made. Harlan said so. He was not a man who said things he didn't mean. She believed him.